Correggio certainly has an important influence on Baroque painters in his treatment of ceilings, which is something that Baroque painters will be increasingly involved with. Correggio is influential because he starts to think about this thing in terms of the point of view of the viewer below, and thinking about also the function of the dome that he's painting as representative of the heavens. So he'll make it look, as he does here, as if the dome opens up to the heavens above, and you see this heavenly light that emanates around Christ, and you have the apostles that are surrounding here, and they are still tilted towards the viewer. We're still seeing them almost parallel to the picture plane, but they're somewhat foreshortened. Baroque artist will increase that foreshortening so that there's a greater sense of illusionism, and it really looks like these figures are, in fact, up above you. But Correggio is instrumental in starting painting down that path. He certainly was influenced by the work of Andrea Mantegna, who also had thought about ceilings a bit differently. This is a work from the 15th century, right around 1565-70, that is a bedroom, actually, a bedroom ceiling in the Gonzaga Palace in Mantua in Palazzo Ducale. And you can see that he has this vaulting that's all fictive. It's meant to look like stucco, but it's just all painted. And then you have this opening up of what's clearly a foreshortened space, a dome that goes up and then opens up. And it opens up to this gorgeous blue sky, and you have little putti figures that are very foreshortened. And then above them, looking over the edge of this rim, are different figures looking down actually on the marital bed below. Certainly, Mantegna uses a bit of sense of humor as you have this precariously placed pot with what looks like olive branches. It looks like it's getting ready to fall down at any second. And certainly this is kind of indicative of the kind of court culture at Mantua, as we'll see in just a little bit with Giulio Romano. This is another one of Correggio's ceilings, this one from the Cathedral of Parma, and here we see the Assumption of the Virgin. Here she is being bodily assumed, pushed up to heaven by this throng of angels, and you get this unending sense of the multitude of figures that are included here and then are just sort of eventually enveloped into this heavenly light above. And it's certainly foreshortened. It's certainly, showing this kind of interest in the illusionism, this opening up of the ceiling to the heavenly light beyond. And as I said, this will be an important influence for Baroque painters that come after this. Another interesting painter who's working in northern Italy in this period is Parmigianino. And as his name suggests, he was from Parma. Parmigianino is a nickname for him. But this is a self-portrait that he did in or it's meant to look like it's done in a convex mirror. So to do this, Parmigianino has looked into a convex mirror, and he has replicated what he sees on what is in fact a convex canvas. He did this for a number of reasons. For one thing, a convex mirror was an incredibly expensive object to own. It suggests some sort of financial stability, at the very least, on Parmigianino's part. That is further indicated by the clothes he has on. He has on this fur kind of vest and a fancy white shirt beneath. We see he has a little gold ring on his hand. He looks like someone from a good standing family. The function of this image was that he planned to send it to, and did send it to, the Pope, Clement VII. His hope was to show the Pope how innovative he was as a painter and what he was capable of, this kind of illusionism, these new innovative ways of thinking about things he was. Parmigianino had worked side by side with Correggio on a number of projects, but was clearly interested in breaking out and becoming an artist in his own right. And his hope was that Clement VII would have him come to Rome and work for him, which in fact did happen. But Parmigianino knew how to appeal to the Pope with this kind of display of his self, and it certainly relates to the ideas that we've talked about with the Paragone, this debate between painting and sculpture, and how painters claimed that painting was a more noble art because you could be a nobleman and do it. You could dress well and do it, unlike sculpture. And Parmigianino is clearly showing that off here. The emphasis here on his right hand, of course, makes a lot of sense because it is the hand that he uses to paint with, and is instrumental for his product and for this painting in particular, of course. And so is significant in that sense as well. You can see from the side here that it is in fact a convex panel that this is on, and that format was certainly unusual and innovative. Of course, as we're looking at this image, we're meant to understand it as a reflection, but of course it's not us that we're seeing in the image, it is Parmigianino. And this kind of play with the viewer and thinking about what the viewer perceives and sees is something that artists are increasingly interested in from this point onward. Style becomes increasingly, well, different as time goes on. Um, we could call this mannerism, though, as we've seen, mannerism is kind of a tricky term to use in that, some define it as being a purely Florentine phenomenon, and Parmigianino was not in Florence, but there are some characteristics here that we would identify as being related to those same ideas of mannerism, like the elongated figures, these strange and twisting figures, this kind of odd juxtaposition of figures in space that's kind of difficult to identify. Here we have Jerome, who is looks a bit passed out and has his arm up. That's one of the gestures to indicate a vision is taking place. And this is in fact the vision that he's seeing with John the Baptist, the Christ child, and the Virgin Mary. This strange color palette that is used is also looking rather Central Italian mannerist. One more example of Parmigianino's work is this painting, the Madonna with the long neck, perhaps certainly one of his most famous paintings besides his self-portrait. And here too, there are certain obvious affinities with Central Italian Mannerist painting. The incredibly elongated figures, the kind of strange sense of space here. You have the very large Madonna and Child and Angels here in the foreground, and then all of a sudden we assume we're way back in space, and there's this figure of St. Jerome. Part of this strangeness is this is not a finished work. So some of it we just have to kind of recreate in our minds, and some of it perhaps would make more sense, like presumably this was part of a temple, not just a row of columns that don't actually support anything. Nevertheless, certainly there's this kind of unexpected eroticism in the image. The leg of this angel here, that we see the nipple of the Virgin, that the drapery clings to her stomach, the kind of androgyny of the angels. And so that's a little odd. Odder yet still, perhaps, is the treatment of the Christ child, who looks, based on his size, to be maybe 3 years old. He's way too large for the lap of his mother, really, but still, a bald baby. But also, we see a baby that has this kind of greenish grayish hue, and clearly we're meant to reflect on the connection between the baby Christ and then what happens to him later in life as he is crucified and dies. We've seen these foreshadowings in paintings before, and think of, for example, Michelangelo's Madonna of the Stairs. However, here, precisely because it's in paint instead of sculpture, perhaps, that color of the flesh is startling and inescapable in its message. This painting, though, isn't just a pure example of Mannerist influence. And there was a brilliant article written, I don't know, it's probably been 20 years ago now, but by Elizabeth Cropper. And what she discovered is that by looking at treatises on beauty in the Renaissance, treatises that were being written right around when Parmigianino was doing this painting, and sources that he would have been familiar with, she was able to trace that each of the features of the Virgin in particular relate to treatises, the way ideals of beauty are described, and they're really specific, like the shape of the eye, the proportion of the nose, the color of the cheeks, the elongated neck of the Virgin, that there are very shallow sort of shoulders that curve, the elegance of the elongated fingers, even the color of the Virgin's hair. All of these relate exactly to these treatises about ideal beauty. And so it may very well be that Parmigianino's motives in depicting the Virgin and these angels in this way relates less to Mannerism and those ideas about, making it super intellectual and all of that stuff, and instead relate more to his aspiration for the Virgin and these angels to look as closely as possible to the ideals of absolute beauty of this period, which of course makes a lot of sense. Just to see it a little bit more closely, the colors that are used, it's a really cold palette. And again, part of that could be because it's not complete, so the colors seem especially kind of cold and gray toned. But parts of it clearly are quite finished, like this drapery on the Virgin. It's beautifully done. It's a gorgeous painting. This painting is at the Uffizi in Florence. These beautiful heads. Parmigianino does quite well with that style, and it certainly has an impact on Lombard artists of his generation. Another artist who worked in Rome for a time, but then flees Rome, as most artists did, after the sack of Rome in 1527, is Giulio Romano. Giulio ends up in Mantua working for the Gonzaga court, and there does a great number of commissions of all sorts: architecture, painting, ephemeral works like stagecraft kind of things for triumphal entries and theatrical performances. This is one building he designed, the Palazzo del Te. This was the sort of party palace of the Gonzaga family. And this kind of playful nature of the function of the building is certainly related to how Giulio conceived of its design. In that, what we see him doing here is using a variety of architectural elements that their use together breaks those rules of high Renaissance architecture, just as we saw Michelangelo did at San Lorenzo in the chapels he did for the Medici and in the vestibule of the library. So this too would signal a Mannerist influence, just as Parmigianino's painting did. What we see at the Palazzo del Te is, as you can see, each side of the building is different in its design, which is highly unusual to say the least, and part of this new approach of Giulio's. This is one of the inner courtyard views, and in it you can see some of these strange juxtapositions of architectural elements, like this rustication with these fine columns that are not rusticated, this use of the what we would call um, the colossal order suggests the connection with the work of architecture that Michelangelo did at the Capitoline Hill buildings. Some empty window spaces, empty, filled in windows even, and blank niches. Um, and then this overabundance of decoration in the Metopian triglyph area, and then with all of this rustication, certainly indicates a very playful approach to the architectural design. The rustication, which usually would serve a function in that they should be the big building blocks that the building is made of, here it's made quite clear that they're just for show, and in fact there are even spaces that are blank. I'm missing that rustication to show you that this is just a regular wall behind them, and it's not actually blocks stacked up to make the wall space. So all of that is very innovative and playful, and that certainly fits in with the function of the building. Here's another one of the facades, again using the colossal order, this time with pilasters. You've got rustication here, finer cut ashlar masonry on the second floor, triglyph and metope system. It's just decoration of some sort in abundance. You have these massive keystones that break into the string course area, that kind of overlapping of details that we saw Michelangelo doing in San Lorenzo, and we identified there as being a new approach that some would call Mannerist. This is just one of the entry points into the courtyard from the facade, and I show it to you just to show you this kind of interesting approach to the columns. And Giulio has made it so that they look really rough, and it's supposed to be sort of look like a natural phenomenon, that these are the sort of like a cave wall that have just happened to form into columns. And again, it's just this sort of playful approach to building design. Giulio was certainly influenced by Mantegna's Camera dei Sposi as well, and of course he knew it well because he was working for the same family, the Gonzagas, just a generation or so later. And in the decoration of Palazzo del Te, he clearly pulled from some of the ideas that Mantegna starts here, in that he, makes it so that there's this kind of fictive decoration that kind of tricks the viewer, and that is certainly made clear, and we just saw this, so I won't go into it any further, but this illusionism that we see here is an important source for Giulio Romano as he is working on the decoration, the fresco decoration of some of the rooms inside of Palazzo del Te. In this one we have the gods on Mount Olympus and the fall of the giants, we have no indication of architectural elements here. And in fact, when you step into this space, you're completely consumed by the decoration. The room truly seems to be falling in on you as the clouds and the gods push forth against these giants who have been trying to stack up boulders to reach up into the heavens. And those boulders are starting to come crashing down. And you can see that in some of these other views here. The columns here have been broken and the walls are collapsing. And you really get a sense of that in this room. And the spinning design of the pavement only adds to the kind of sense of bewilderment and even dizziness